Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue the reading of Village Diary by Miss Reed. July. Arthur Cogs has been in trouble again, and the village is having a great deal of secret enjoyment at his expense. Mr. Willett was my informant, punctuating his account with so many guffaws that I found myself roaring with laughter long before the point of the story had been told me. It appears that Jim Waits had been missing chicken food from his store at the end of the garden at Tyler's Row on several occasions, and he strongly suspected that Arthur Cogs helped himself, under cover of darkness, to a few handfuls of corn and bran for his own bedraggled hens that led a miserably confined existence in a ramshackle run next door. Jim Waits kept the chicken food in an old air raid shelter. In the musty darkness, bicycles jostled garden tools, ropes of onions swung overhead, firewood was stacked in one corner, and the other awkward objects, too cumbersome to find a home in the little cottage, here found a resting place. The shelter had been erected at the beginning of the war by a Don from Cambridge who had taken over the cottage for his wife and young family. Two things kept his memory fresh in Fairacre: the incredible speed with which he had completed this air raid shelter, and the looks of his progeny. "Never seed a chap rush at a job so," Mr. Rogers at the forge told me once. "Skinny little bit he was, too, all teeth and glasses, but his arms was like flails waving around. One minute there was an old hedge there, next minute this here contraption. Cor, he fair flung hisself at work, that chap." Mrs. Pringle supplied details of his family. "4 of 'em, all under 6, all as thin as scarecrows, with braces on their teeth, those that had 'em, and their clothes, them open sandals, all weathers, and skirts and jerseys you'd have thought twice about sending to the jumble. Fed on health foods they was, and no advertisement for 'em neither. And she was a funny lot, too. Said she'd been to an economical school up in London somewhere, and she didn't have no objection to her kids playing with the village ones." Mrs. Pringle bristled at the memory, her 3 chins wobbling aggressively. "I sorted her out proper. Perhaps our village women," I says to her haughty, "has some objection to our kids playing with yours." She didn't like that, I could see. Why, if she washed once a month, it was a miracle, and then the whites was as black as a crow. I know for a fact she never done no boiling. Shameful she were. One night recently, Jim Waits had been on the lookout for his shady neighbor. He had settled himself comfortably on an upturned wheelbarrow behind the ivy-covered privy at the end of his garden, and patiently surveyed the stars above as he listened for any suspicious sounds. In his pocket, the heavy key of the shelter door, which he had looked out, lay against his thigh. The regulars, including Arthur Cogs, had returned from the Beetle when, about half an hour later, Jim Waits heard some furtive rustling among the elder bushes which now overhung the building, and the soft clanking of a pail, which presumably was to carry home the stolen goods. Jim heard the scrape of the door on the stone floor and cautiously peered round the corner of the privy. A flickering torchlight hovered about the inside shelter. Swiftly, Jim Waits ran down the 3 rickety steps, drew the door to, and locked it securely. The torch had been switched off hastily, and there was no sound from the dark interior. Whistling jauntily, swinging the key round and round on his finger, Jim Waits made his way to bed. He said nothing to his pretty wife about the matter until 3 o'clock in the morning. She had woken him, saying, Jim, there's someone trying to get in, listen." From a distance came the sound of heavy thumping, an occasional crash, and outburst of invective. Arthur Cogs was getting belligerent, and having thought up a story, thin enough but he hoped plausible, was ready to bluff his way back to everyday life. "Go to sleep," counseled Jim Waits. "It's only that fool Arthur Cogs. I've left him to cool his heels in the shelter." He told his wife the story, and although she was worried about the poor wife next door, she recognized the rough justice of her husband's action and even began to enjoy the distant rumblings from the end of the garden. "Serves him right," said Mrs. Waits, plumping up her pillow. "Kathy and me took a week to glean that corn. That'll teach him a lesson." She slept again. Mrs. Cogs next door had also heard the rumpus and knew instantly that her husband was the cause. She had known of these illicit excursions, although no words had passed, and she wondered now what she should do. The idea that Jim Waits had purposely trapped Arthur did not occur to her. She imagined that the door had blown to, imprisoning the malefactor, and she trembled at the thought of the Waits next door being awakened and investigating the disturbance. Should she creep down and release him before the Waits discovered him? A proper wife wouldn't think twice about it. A distant roar, as of a caged tiger, prompted a more prudent course. Many a bruise on poor Mrs. Cogs' unlovely and neglected person had been bestowed there by her husband's heavy fist, when in just such a temper as he was now. Best let him cool off, thought Mrs. Cogs, with 7 years of married wisdom behind her. He put himself in there, didn't he? Well, he could get himself out now. Meanwhile, she stretched herself luxuriously amidst the frosty blankets, enjoying the unwonted pleasure of plenty of room in the bed. Time enough to face the trouble when it came, she told her uneasy conscience grimly. There would always be plenty of that as long as she was Arthur Cogs' wife. She fell into a troubled sleep. At 6:30, she rose. All was quiet, and the summer sun warmed to the dilapidated thatch of the cottages in Tyler's Row. She crept down the creaking stairs, lit the Primus stove to heat the kettle for tea, put a packet of cereal on the table for the children's breakfast, and was about to set off for the shelter when she heard the kitchen door of the Waits house slam and Jim Waits' cheerful voice. "I'll feed the hens for you. Gotta go down." Mrs. Cogs was torn between fear and curiosity. The latter won. Snatching up a bowl of chicken scraps, she too hurried down to the garden to feed her own chickens. Unseen by Jim Waits, who was descending the steps to the shelter, she prudently hid behind her own hen house where she could hear what transpired. Jim Waits pulled back the door and stood, key in hand, smiling at his sullen prisoner. "Had a good night, Arthur?" he asked. A torrent of abuse greeted this mild opening. Arthur Cogs had had ample time to think up his story, and he presented it with all the righteous indignation of the born liar. "I'll have the law on you," he blustered. "I come round here last night to see if my leghorn had strayed and didn't want her eating up your corn." "Did you find her?" queried the unruffled Jim. "No, I never," said Arthur shortly, "but her's missing. Only leghorn I got, too. Bet that old dog fox been around and has had her." He warmed again to his original theme, all the more annoyed because of this side issue which had distracted him. "But you've no call to lock folks up all night, innocent folks, too. What about me poor wife?" "Glad to see the back of you for a bit, I dare say," rejoined the other equably. The listener behind the neighboring henhouse concurred silently. "What did you bring that pail for? To carry your chicken in?" "You must know," said Arthur with cold dignity. "I brought a bit of corn round to tempt her home." Jim Waits burst into loud laughter. "You're the biggest liar I ever met. Why didn't you tell me this yarn last night when I turned the key? You was mighty quiet then, hoping you could sneak out when I hopped it, eh? Found you couldn't and worked up this rigmarole. There's not a soul in Fairacre will believe that lot of nonsense, Arthur Cogs, and you know it. Clear off home, will you, and don't come in here pinching again, or I'll have the law on you next time." Still muttering dark threats, his tousled neighbor emerged into the sunlight and pushed through the ragged dividing hedge to his own cinder path. "Take your rubbish with you," shouted Jim Waits, who had just glimpsed his wife at the back door and decided he must put on a more masterful display. The bucket sailed over the hedge, landing with a clatter among the squawking hens. Jim Waits saw the flutter of Mrs. Cogs' crumpled skirt among the flying wings. "Got your leghorn there safely, Mrs. Cogs?" he bellowed mischievously. "Yes, thank you," said Mrs. Cogs timidly. "You keep your trap shut," growled her husband furiously and stumped toward the kitchen door. The Cogs entered together. The kettle had boiled over. The Primus poured forth a hissing cloud of noxious paraffin vapor. Joseph Cogs stood by the table, his fist inside the cereal packet. He watched his father stamp blackly up the stairs. "Where's Dad been?" he asked his grim-faced mother. "Making a fool of himself," said she, giving herself the satisfaction of raising her voice so that it could be clearly heard above. It was one of her rare moments of triumph. The first Saturday in July was set aside for Fairacre's combined Sunday school and choir outing, as usual. Miss Clare was unable to come with us this year, as she had promised to go with her sister to visit an old friend who had come from Scotland to spend a few days in the neighborhood. The vicar fluttered round the two coaches, which were drawn up in front of the church like a mother hen with straying chicks. Mrs. Pringle, swollen with majesty as head counter for the day, had taken up her stance at the top of the steps inside the coach and seriously impeded the entrances and exits of the party. "If," she boomed heavily, the cherries on her straw hat trembling, "you was to sit quiet and steady in your own seats, it would be an instance to me countin'." This reproof was ignored, as squeaking children changed places, excited parents bobbed up and down to put things on racks, and relatives and well-wishers from the other coach constantly appeared, vanished, reappeared, and generally made themselves as ubiquitous as possible. As Mrs. Partridge had foreseen when bestowing this office on Mrs. Pringle, it was going to keep that lady very busy. Mr. Maughan, looking vaguely about him, was the last to appear, and Mrs. Partridge led him triumphantly along our crowded coach to the empty seat beside me. The hum of noisy chattering stopped suddenly, a pregnant silence taking its place, while knowing looks and nudges were exchanged. "There we are," said Mrs. Partridge in the comforting tone of one returning a lost baby to its mother. It says much for civilization that Mr. Maughan and I were capable of greeting each other with smiles under such provocation. 32, bellowed Mrs. Pringle from the front. 32, right? She poked her head out the door to shout this to the vicar, who stood on the steps of the coach in front. It should be 33, dear Mrs. Pringle, the vicar's pulpit voice fluted back. A hubbub of counting began in our coach, half the travelers standing up, the other half begging them to sit down. The din was appalling. I makes it 31 now, said Mr. Willett in a desperate tone. He looked uncomfortably spruce in his Sunday dark blue serge, and his face shone red above a tight white collar. I was on the floor, said a husky voice, and Joseph Cogs emerged from beneath a seat, wiping his filthy hands on the front of his best jersey. 32, boomed Mrs. Pringle again with awful finality. I wondered if it would be engraved on her heart when she died, and if so, would it be in letters or figures? This idle fancy was interrupted by Mr. Maughan saying firmly, You have forgotten yourself, Mrs. Pringle. 32, and you make 33. Sourly, Mrs. Pringle intimated that this was in fact the case, waved her approval to the vicar, and then puffed her way down the aisle to the seat behind Mr. Maughan and me. To rousing cheers, the party set off to Beresford. Mr. Maughan had an ill-assorted collection of luggage with him for a day's outing. 3 books in an insecure strap he put up on the rack, together with a small fishing net and a rather messy packet in grease-proof paper, which presumably held his lunch, and a very large green apple, obviously intended by the Almighty for baking, served with plenty of brown sugar and cream. His magnificent camera, housed in a leather case which gleamed like a horse chestnut, he held carefully on his thin knees, occasionally whizzing the strap round and round in an absent-minded fashion, perilously near my face. For the first part of the journey, he seemed content to gaze about him silently, but after we had stopped for coffee at a roadside cafe and resumed our seats, he became quite talkative. Mrs. Pringle leant forward behind us, the better to hear the conversation. Do you go out much in the evening? Asked Mr. Maughan politely. Or do you have schoolwork, marking, and so on to occupy you? I told him that I usually spent a little time on school affairs, chiefly correspondence with the local education office, ordering new stock, checking school accounts, and so on, but that otherwise household matters and the garden filled up most of my time. And I read a lot, I added. Excellent, excellent, said he, but surely you find your life a little lonely at times? I was conscious of Mrs. Pringle's heightened interest behind me. I was obliged to tell Mr. Maughan quite truthfully that I had never felt lonely in my life. It seems, if I may say so, a very restricted life for a woman, particularly an attractive woman. He essayed a small bow, but was somewhat impeded by the camera. Mrs. Pringle's breathing became more marked in my left ear. I can assure you, I said, acknowledging the compliment with a polite smile, that it's a very full life. Too full at times. The days don't seem long enough. Mr. Maughan dropped his eyes to his lap and spoke sadly. I find them too long, I'm afraid, particularly cold, long summer evenings. By this time, Mrs. Pringle's face was almost between our heads, and I could see the agitated cherries from the corner of my eye. Ignoring the pathos of poor Mr. Maughan's tone, I hurled myself into an overbright description of making jam on just such a cold, long summer evening as Mr. Maughan disliked, steering erratically, and perhaps a trifle hysterically, from the particular to the general, while Mrs. Pringle's breathing stirred the hair on my neck. When at last I paused for breath, Mr. Maughan gave me a gentle, sad smile. "You are very lucky," he said slowly. "I think perhaps a man needs companionship more than a woman does." He relapsed into dreamy silence, and we both watched the outskirts of Beresford rushing past the windows. Mrs. Pringle released the iron grip she had held on the back of our seat, and, well content with her eavesdropping, settled her bulk back on her own cushions and gave a gusty sigh. To my relief, and no doubt to Mrs. Pringle's disappointment, Mr. Maughan bade me a kindly farewell at Beresford and set off with brisk, purposeful strides along the beach to some distant rocks which were awash with a lazy tide. The children rushed seawards, while we older Fairacre folk settled ourselves on the warm sand and, screwing up our eyes against the dazzle, watched the seagulls swooping and crying in the vivid blue sky. Mrs. Moffat watched Linda setting off to the water, clad in a dashing yellow sunsuit of her making, then sat herself down beside me. She obviously had something of importance to say. "Do you mind?" she began. "I wanted to speak with you on the coach, but I didn't like to interrupt your conversation with Mr. Maughan. He looked so happy." This was all very hard to bear, I thought, and I could only hope that the recording angel was ready with pencil to note with what fortitude and long suffering I was enduring these mortifications. "I wanted to thank you for sending your friend to me. She's introduced several more people from Bent, and Hilda and I are making nearly a dozen costumes for the pageant." I said that was wonderful. And did Hilda, Mrs. Finch Edwards, find she could manage this work with the baby? "She's marvelous," said Mrs. Moffat with fervor. "She's borrowed dozens of books about costume from the county library, and Mrs. Bond, who is in charge of organizing of the pageant, is coming over to see us both next week to see how we're getting on. The costumes must be historically correct, of course. It's fascinating work." I asked her if Amy had been able yet to introduce both of them to a film producer. "Not yet," she replied, "but I believe Mrs. Bond knows him well. She may tell us more when we see her." She rose in answer to a distant shout from her daughter, who was gazing fascinated at something in the surf that swirled about her ankles. I leaned back against sunny breakwater and dozed off. Our Mr. Edward at Bunce's, the famous tea shop, was elegant in a light fawn worsted suit exquisitely cut. He showed us to our tables in an upper room and personally supervised the serving of delicious ham and salad, swooping round with plates ranged up his arm. Mr. Maughan did not appear at tea, but we found him when we returned to the coach, busily making notes in the margin of one of his 3 books. It was, I saw, a book about birds. His face was bright pink with sunshine and salt air, and he greeted me almost boisterously. I was glad to see his spirits had recovered. Mrs. Pringle bared her teeth at us in a ghastly, sickly leer as she sidled by to her place. "Now you two will be all right," she said, as though bestowing a blessing on a bridal pair. Mr. Maughan appeared not to hear and continued with his animated account of the purple sandpiper. "I knew it," he said emphatically, slapping his book gaily. "When I heard that Beresford was the place, I thought, now's my chance." Mrs. Pringle, catching the last few words, inclined the cherries a little nearer. "I saw quite a dozen sandpipers. The purple sandpiper," he added, peering anxiously into my face. "There are a number of sandpipers, you know." I went into a pleasant trance while he rattled on. The purple sandpiper, I said to myself, and the lesser sandpiper, and the crested sandpiper, and the continental sandpiper, and of course the English-speaking sandpiper. The coach roared on, and we must have been halfway to Fairacre before he finished triumphantly. "And I've taken 23 photographs, both waiting and on the wing, so I've really accomplished more than I set out to do today. I'll set this fellow Huggett to rights." Here he slapped the book again. "A pompous ass. We were at school together, and what he knows about the purple sandpiper could be written on a pinhead." And with this charitable remark, he settled back with the evening paper and read with the closest attention a very sordid account of a young girl drug addict who had been found murdered on one of the ugliest divans ever to find its way into the photographs of the evening press. The Monday following an outing often brings some absentees from school, and today was no exception. The twins, Helen and Diana, were reported to have nettle rash and colds, which sounded suspiciously like chicken pox to me and to Miss Clare. Several others looked decidedly mopey, and Ernest in my room has spent most of his school day rubbing his back against the desk behind him in order to gain relief from "an itch and sunburn, miss, done Saturday." Miss Clare confessed over her morning tea that it was a relief not to have the twins in her classroom. "There they sit," she said sadly, "breathing away through their mouths, eyes glazed, and nothing in their heads after 5 terms. They still choose a penny instead of sixpence because it's bigger, although I've put out 6 pennies for sixpence and explained it time and time again." I sympathized with her. "And mark my words," she continued, their far-seeing teacher, "they'll both have anything up to 6 children apiece, all as dull as they are themselves. Just you wait and see." In the evening, I drove Mrs. Annett to Springbourne to see if Minnie Pringle would come daily to Beech Green Schoolhouse when Mrs. Annett is confined. "There just seems to be no one else to ask," she said as we wound along the narrow lane from Fairacre. "There are no nice spare women these days, no kind single aunts to step into the breach, and I've no sisters who might spare a few days." She looked rosy and cheerful despite it all, and trotted very nimbly up the brick path to the thatched cottage which housed Minnie, her 3 illegitimate children, and her virago of a mother. I drove up the cart track just off the narrow road to wait till the business was over. It was an oppressive evening, with a stillness that held the threat of thunder. The trees were beginning to look over-heavy and shabby, and in the field beside the car there spread into the hazy distance the sullen khaki shade of July wheat. It was so quiet that small sounds, usually unheard, were quite clear. A dead bramble leaf, swinging brown and brittle on a thread nearby, cracked dryly as it touched a twig. A pigeon rocketed over the hedge and clapped its wings shut with a hollow, bony snap as of a closing fan. I felt as though I had been worlds away by the time Mrs. Annett returned to the car, all her arrangements satisfactorily made, as would ever be possible with such a scatterbrained creature as Minnie Pringle. We drove home together under the lowering sky and were safely indoors before the storm broke.